G'day and welcome to another episode of Built by Dan. You've probably worked it out already. Today we're going to be focusing on the rear suspension on my GT40 kit car. So I've already gone through and worked out each bolt for each of the components so that I know what I've got. To be honest, it took me probably about an hour off camera to actually work through the bolt boxes, find the appropriate bolts, and I've just put them on finger tight onto each bracket so that I know where each one goes, just to make the installation a lot simpler. And I obviously do that just to make it a bit smoother process for the purpose of recording. But even if I wasn't recording it, I'd probably still follow the same process. It's just a good way to make sure that you've got everything allocated to the right part before you get started, so that there's no guessing once you go to bolt the pieces or the brackets onto the chassis. So some of these chassis bolt locations have a solid aluminium boss welded inside, and some of them just aren't quite lining up, so I'll just have to grab a drill bit and drill them out so I've got enough clearance to be able to push the bolt through without it getting snagged on the chassis hole on the opposite side. The good old angle drill has come in quite handy on this build so far. So each of the parts, I'm not sure how well you can see that, have a letter stamped into them. That's to identify where they go, but it also helps you, so if you can't read that, it's not sitting in the right position. So you know which way it should face and which way should be up or down. So similar to the other stages of the build, I'm just putting these nuts on finger tight until I can get everything installed and I know that it's in the right place. It's just good to have that little bit of give until you know that everything is fitting in correctly. So this is sort of just an example of how I set it all up. I sort of worked out which bolt was which, where they all went, and just sat them in the holes so that I can easily identify which one's which. It only takes a couple of seconds to undo them as you get to each component and then bolt it onto the chassis. Might have a slight alignment issue here with the welded in bosses and the bracket. Okay, and my next piece here, I actually need to unbolt this rear support because it shares a bolt with this bracket, so it'll get bolted into this top and bottom mounting boss. So I'm just going to check that bolt size. Looks like it is already the correct bolt size that we need to use, so I may not need to replace it. Might be able to use the one that's already in there. So I just wanted to do that one back up just to hold all this together and not have it sort of under any tension. We'll see how that goes. The bottom one here is just finger tight. So that basically leaves us one piece to fit. The only problem is the bracket that's been supplied has the 2 bolt holes here. They should be on the opposite side so they can mount into the welded in bosses on the chassis. So I'm going to get a new piece sent from the manufacturer, but for the time being, what I will do is I'll sit it in place and just clamp it down, and I'll drill through from the bottom through the mounting bosses, and I'll be able to temporarily mount this piece. This is the lower shock mount, so it's pretty important to be able to get the hole set up to sit right and to ensure that it all goes together correctly. So right now I've just got the pivot bolts that support both the upper control arm, one of the push rods, but I'm going to need a bigger drill bit to drill out those holes again, just having a bit of an issue with alignment. When they've welded in the bosses from one side, they're just not quite aligned on the other. Okay, so here we have one side of the brackets all installed for the rear suspension. So I've inserted all of the pivot bolts as well where appropriate. The only one I didn't do was just this one at the top here for the bell crank. So this is the bell crank bracket. So it'll have a push rod that will come down to the lower control arm, and on the other end the shock will connect to the bell crank and then down to this lower shock mount. Got a bracket each side here. These 2 are for the lower control arm. And that's pretty much it. That sums up the suspension mounting points for the driver's side of the GT40. I'll now jump across and do the passenger side, and we'll then move on to assembling the control arms, the push rods and the bell cranks so that we can then install them. Okay, so just like the driver's side, the passenger side suspension mounting brackets are now fitted off finger tight. The next step will be to start assembling the push rods, the uprights, the control arms and the bell cranks, and then getting all that fitted off. Might actually start looking like a car rather than just a frame. Okay, so now we're ready to make a start on assembling some of the suspension components. We've got the main upright, camber bracket that needs to be bolted to the upright, the upper control arm mounting bracket that gets bolted to the upright, some support brackets for the rear control arm mounting point. We've got the push rod and toe link adjusters and the rod ends that need to be fitted to them. Upper control arm, lower control arm. We have the push rod mounting bracket that gets bolted onto the lower control arm here. We've got the rod ends for the control arms where they mount to the chassis, and the bell crank to mount the other end of the push rod and the shock absorber. So I'm going to go ahead and start assembling them. I might try and zoom in a little bit so you can see a bit better what I'm doing, and hopefully I won't zoom in too far like I did in the last episode and couldn't actually see what I was doing. Okay, I think I'm going to start with the bell crank, only because it's a nice simple one, then I can get them out of the way and give myself a little bit more space here on the bench. So basically I have the two halves. I've already pressed a bearing into each half. Now I need to go and install these bosses that will separate the two halves. So they're basically mounted on top. And then there's also just a separator there that goes between the bearings as well. So I'm going to screw these bosses in on one side, then we can place that in the middle and then bolt in the other side, and we'll be able to test fit against the rod end and the shock end as well. So that's just those 3 bolts in there. The bosses on the back, so they're threaded bosses. Not sure how much adjustment I'm going to have to move that spacer around. So that spacer actually just wants to fall out there. So there's not much holding that in at all. Once it gets the pivot bolt through there, it should be fine. They're quite tight, so it's not that it's not fitting together. So these bell cranks actually look quite nice. All laser cut, just some markings left on it from the stock material that they used. So I think when I get to final assembly, I'd definitely be looking to polish these up. They'll look really nice sitting there, especially when you open the rear clip, which I assume every time I stop the car, most people are going to want me to do. So may as well make sure that it looks nice. I'll set that to the side and I might jump on to the push rod and toe link. So I've already organised these. There is a right hand threaded rod end and a left hand threaded rod end. And obviously a left and right hand threaded end to the push rod. They are supposed to have a marking on them according to the manual, but unfortunately these ones do not have a marking, but they seem to have actually written 12-inch, the length of the push rod, on the left hand end. So now I'm not sure how much thread I should be leaving here in terms of the adjustment. I think from memory the build manual did have something, or actually I think it had a section where it said leave X millimeters sticking out, but it literally just had 3 X's. It didn't actually define what that measurement should be. So I'm leaving about 1 centimeter, 10 millimeters for now. And once I get it fitted up, I mean, it'll all be part of the suspension adjustment towards the end of the build. If I can find something in the build manual though, I will adjust them before then. So basically these little bushes had to be pressed into all the rod ends. So I did do that and then added a lock nut onto each one, both obviously left and right hand threaded, so that we can lock them off into position to square away our suspension geometry. So that's the push rod done. Moving on to the rear toe link. The left hand thread gets me every time. It just feels so unnatural threading the opposite direction. Again, I'm going to leave about 1 centimeter of thread as an initial adjustment. So that's those two done. I'll move them out of the way. Now I might just grab the control arms back. So we have an upper and a lower control arm that sit like that. I'm going to go ahead and mount. This is the lower push rod mounting bracket. So the push rod extends from this bracket on the control arm up to the bell crank. Still like to tighten that last little bit by hand. So now that that is mounted, I can go ahead and install the rod ends on the inside. So you can see some of the bushings there just fall back out. It's a fairly accurate fit, but sometimes some of them are just that little bit loose. Again, I'm just going with about a 1 centimetre or 10 millimetre exposed thread to start off with. So that's the insides done. Now the outside has a different rod end, so I'll just go and grab that and I'll insert that now as well. I'm just going to apply a lock nut onto that first. The bush is just pushed back in there. Now I just need to grab a lock nut for the outer rod end. Okay, so that's the upper control arm complete. Now on to assembling the upright. So to start off with, that's the direction of the upright. Brake caliper will bolt on there later, and obviously the hub onto here. The lower control arm gets mounted through the bottom here. So there is just this little plate that gets bolted on there with a couple of little bolts, and then the mounting bolt feeds through and a nut will get inserted up here. If I flip that over, we've got the bracket to mount the upper control arm that gets bolted through from the face. So the head of the bolt on the face, nuts at the back. And then we've got the toe link bracket that'll get bolted on there as well. Same story, threaded through from the front. And then the tie rod end will sit in here and be bolted through. It's a bit odd. It appears that the main shaft of the bolt is a little too wide for the hole that's in there. Why don't you go grab one of the other bolts that were in that part of the kit and test that out. Okay, I've got another bolt here. Yep, just seems to be that one bolt for some reason. All right, so I've taken some time off camera and I've literally gone through every bolt supplied in the kit of this size, and none of the 2-inch long bolts want to pass through. So some of them will just sort of give a little bit, but it shouldn't be that tight. I'm reluctant to do anything to actually drill out these holes any larger because we are talking about the suspension components here. They're supposed to be a perfect fit so that there is no slack or slop in the suspension. We don't want it to have any give. So I'm just going to have to park it for today. Really disappointed, and consult with the manufacturer once again as to what the issue is here. It's called up for 2-inch bolts. None of them fit past the unthreaded shank. However, if I was to grab any of the same size 3/8" bolts in a 2 1/4" length, they fit perfectly. So I'm hoping it is just a manufacturing issue with the supplied 2" bolts, and I can get some new ones. But at this stage, or for today, pretty much going to have to call it there. I think off camera I'll probably assemble all the other components for the other side. So all the control arms, the bell crank, the push rod and toe link. Yeah, I don't know. There's been a few comments online with some of my other videos about whether I'm concerned about the amount of work that I'm having to do to make things fit. It's sort of getting to that stage, to be honest. To some extent, I think there's probably a bit of give and take that I expected there'd be a little bit of work to adjust the tolerance of some items so that they fit properly, but not to the extent where I'm cutting extra holes in the chassis to make things fit. I thought maybe I was just being a bit naive that things would just bolt together nicely. But anyway, continue to work through it. I'm happy to work with the manufacturer and they've been pretty responsive. Hopefully for everybody else's sake, for anyone that does look to buy one of these kits in the future, that they do actually take on board a lot of the feedback that I'm giving them and actually correct things for future kits that they manufacture. I'll stop the video there. I'll come back once I get a response from the manufacturer and we have a way forward so that I can progress the suspension install. In next episode, I'll run through the installation of all the suspension components and we'll finish off that installation. So be sure to tune in a fortnight's time for the next episode. If you like these episodes, please hit the like button. Consider sharing it with any friends or family that may be interested in this sort of content, and subscribe to the channel so you get notifications on future releases.